Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements. We continue our discussion of Judge Sabo's Read on Authority, which is a long discussion of Engels' engagement with anarchism. One where I'm pretty critical. I do think there are many criticals of classical anarchism to be made, but I actually think the one Engels makes is not particularly good. Now, this brings us to the part of the argument where Sabo actually lays out what anarchists classically mean by authority versus what Engels meant with it and whatever logical problems that may have. We are going to be discussing today authority as understood by Bakunin in his Revolutionary Catechism of 1866. I want that to be clear that it's a different Revolutionary Catechism than the Revolutionary Catechism of Sergei Nakiev, which was somebody expelled from the International Working Men's Association who kind of invented Barrack's communism and was aligned to the German nihilist movement. His Catechism of a Revolutionary in 1869, of which Bakunin was associated, is where the Marxist critique of Barrack's communism really comes from. The reason why I want to point that out is I am a strong critic of Barrack's communism. I think it is generally a disaster. And weirdly, it's something, even though traditionally it was a critique of anarcho-communist nihilist in Russia, it's actually more of a problem now amongst like new communist sectarian units, often Maoist ones, which took ultra abstentionist positions and ended up, well, basically, how do I say, murdering each other in self-criticism struggle sessions, which is something that is similar to what actually happened with Negev. Negev has an interesting relationship to the later communist movement because, for example, Vera Sasulik of the Marxist letters to Vera Sasulik same was actually associated with Negev in 1869, as was Bakunin, etc., etc. Now, that's not so much relevant to Judge Sabo's argument here. I just want to make that historical note clear as we go into this, because the Revolutionary Catechism cited here is not that one. It is Bakunin's earlier one from 1866, which is kind of a defining document of anarchism. Now, again, I don't always love this document, but nonetheless, I think it does make some things pretty substantively clear. So let's get into Judge Sabo's actual argument here. All right. Bakunin's writings on authority. Mikhail Bakunin was a Russian anarchist who played an instrumental role in developing, spreading, and organizing anarchist theory within the First International. I mean, arguably, Proudhon and company and the Mutualists were the first anarchists, but anarchism, as we later understand it, or anarcho-communism, really does come out of the Russian-Italian sections of the International Working Men's Association's defection from, that led to the dissolution of the IWA, or the First International. And is remembered as one of Karl Marx's chief opponents. That's actually fair. See, there's many books on this, including The First Socialist Schism. Bakunin's ideas only become distinctly anarchist in the last decade of his life. Yeah, I mean, Bakunin's early battles were actually for national liberation. Bakunin, Engels, and Wagner all fought for German national liberation in 1848, for example. And Bakunin was close to Italian nationalists, the left Italian nationalists, but nonetheless. So Bakunin's ideas run in a lot of different directions. Um, Anyway, Bakunin's ideas only became distinctly anarchist in the last decade of his life, taking shape during his time in Italy between 1864 and 1867. I will be focusing on selective writings from here to elaborate on how he discussed authority, since authority here is discussed in contrast to freedom, autonomy, and anarchy. We also need to build our understanding of these concepts. Revolutionary Catechism, 1866. In 1864, Bakunin helped to found a secret revolutionary group called the International Brotherhood. This is one of the Marxist critiques of propaganda by the deed, as critiques of both Blanqui and of Bakunin having secret brotherhoods of activist revolutionaries, which would be subsequently publish its program and statutes in 3 documents: the International Family, the Revolutionary Catechism, and the National Catechism. Now, the National Catechism, I just want to add, is a little bit more problematic for anarchists today because it is a justification of right-wing thought by people like Troy Southgate of national anarchism. And I do think anarchists should probably deal with this a little bit more substantively than they do, just like they often don't deal with Kropotkin's seeming chauvinism during World War One. All right. Within these, we can see the first formulations of anarchist thought. I will begin our analysis here, putting his Revolutionary Catechism, where he lays out key thoughts on freedom and equality, which are contrasted with authority. Focusing first on the former, we can see how Hume believes these constructs are inherently linked together. Point 3. Long quote from Bakunin. Freedom is the absolute right of every adult, man and woman, to seek no other sanction for their acts than their own conscience and their own reason, being responsible first to themselves and then to the society which they have voluntarily accepted. 4. It is not true that freedom of one man is limited by that of other men. Man is really free to the extent that his freedom, fully acknowledged and mirrored by the free consent of his fellow men, finds confirmation and expansion in their liberty. Man is truly free among equally free men. The slavery of even one human being violates humanity and negates the freedom of all. 5. The freedom of each is therefore realizable only in the equality of all. The realization of freedom through equality in principle and in fact is justice. Now, I think that's an interesting definition of justice, but justice as a normative concept is always contested, so this is as equally valid as almost any other assertion of justice. Nonetheless, it's just something to note. You will note that Bakunin's argument, unlike what Marx and Engels tried to do, and this is actually a fundamental difference in their argumentational styles and logics, is based on a normative argument. Whereas, in line with German idealism in general, Marxists try to argue that the normative and the descriptive are effectively the same, and in fact that the norms actually emerge from the description, negating like any Humean principle of the is-alt distinction. All right, number 6. If there is one fundamental principle of human morality, it is freedom. Now, again, this is just a normative assumption. I want people to realize that. So you can just, part of the problem with this is you can just reject this outright. And Marx and Engels seem to understand that, which is why they try to collapse the normative substantive distinction, as did Hegel and Kant and etc. before them. Bakunin does not do this. He argues essentially on normative grounds. But remember, what Marx says defines equal claims. Equal normative claims are effectively equal if they don't have a substantive or description link. And according to Marx, between equal claims, force decides. So we can already see a distinction here. Now, I point this out because this is part of the critique of Bakunin anarchism that is not dealt with in On Authority. All right, so I want people to understand that, but this is important to understand and just accept what Bakunin is laying out. All right, is Engels actually fairly representing what Bakunin is saying? Now, we can already see he's tried to do the argument that the natural structure of labor makes this authority, different, although in doing so, he's actually created a bunch of conceptual and analytic confusions. Engels has. We've already seen that there's equivocations in his argument, no matter how you parse it. But that's why he's doing it. Bakunin's not doing this. To respect the freedom of your fellow man is a duty. To love, help, and serve him is a virtue. Now, again, we see that Bakunin's just laying this out as a moral argument. All right? We are all free people. We have an obligation to help free people so that we are all free. Right? It is a moral argument. Bakunin here presents an extremely holistic view of freedom as the center of his analysis. Individuals and collective freedom are seen as inherently intertwined, so you cannot have one without the other. No individual adult man or woman must seek sanction from others for their actions, but at the same time, no individual must do this, extending this rule to all. Here, we have here not only a sense of absolute freedom, but also of equal freedom. Equality and freedom are thus intimately linked. Actually, they're intimately linked for both Marx and Bakunin. This is something that gets kind of washed out in 20th and 21st century socialism, partly because of the problem of normative versus descriptive distinctions in Marx. Eventually, people just kind of ignore the concept of freedom altogether, even though it is crucial for Marx too. All right. A natural assumption here would be that these notions contradict one another. I don't know why that's natural, but I get why this is the conservative argument. I'm just bracketing here. Back to JudgeSabo. If an individual is absolutely free, then one might think this would include actions that violate the freedom of others, like the freedom to murder, enslave, exploit, and so on. AKA individualist anarchists of the Stirnerite variety maybe argue this, or individualist nihilists might argue this too. Bakunin certainly agrees that we are not free to do these things. We have a duty to respect the freedom of your fellow man. So why do we have that duty? He doesn't really say. But he disagrees with the individual view of individual freedoms that is in conflict with the freedom of others, whether he wants to argue that our freedom finds confirmation and expansion in the liberty of others. Likewise, the violation of the freedom of others often also hinders our own freedom. Now, again, if we accept Bakunin's normative claims, these all flow, but we have to accept his initial normative claims. Marx and Engels' argument style and what they're trying to lay out is a way to get around that, honestly. Whether or not you think it works is whether or not you think you can actually deduce is from oughts and oughts from ises. Do you think German idealism really does solve the problem that emerges in philosophy from the is-ought distinction after Hume, which is kind of what is the crisis that brings about German idealism's arguments in the first place? All right. Liberty is therefore not only a negative thing, an absence for the need for the sanction or slavery, aka negative liberty as Isaiah Berlin might define it, but also something positively found in other people. For this reason, Bakunin believes freedom is only found among equally free men, and freedom and equality necessarily come together hand in hand. After all, the master has a role to keep the slave down, which actually limits the master's actions. Just to explain why Bakunin actually would think this. It is not as inherently irrational as it may seem, or just a leap of faith. The freedom of each requires the freedom of all. Bakunin advocates for this freedom as the basis of human society. Virtue is found in loving, helping, and serving our fellows. And again, this is a moral argument. One of the critiques that Marxists have made of anarchists is that their argument is effectively just a moral argument and can be rejected, and when rejected by another moral argument, force decides. That's part of the Marxist critique. And I want to state that because this is not the critique Engels makes here. This naturally follows when we see our interests as inherently connected with them, finding our own freedom in their own. The anarchist approach to society is not only fundamentally voluntary, but built upon the relationships of solidarity one another. I think the Marxists would agree, except that they would think that the voluntary notion of it is the problem. That since our functions in maintaining society are not something that we can voluntarily opt in or out of, that you can't voluntarily opt out of social relations and fundamentally stay human. All right. But a lot of the other assumptions Marxists would share, but try to argue on descriptive, not moral grounds. Okay. And again, this is a problem. This is a problem that Marxists have even itself admitted. One of the analytic Marxists and certain kinds of political Marxists have argued that the insistence that you can derive an is from a not in Marxism actually doesn't actually work. Because it makes a lot of fundamentally normative claims based off of descriptive processes. And if those descriptive processes turn out not to be true, say communism is not inevitable, for example, then you have a real problem. This actually does lead to ambiguities in Marx, which plague Marxist thinking across the board. And I want to state this because I want people to know I'm not just coming down and like throwing all the Marxist arguments against anarchism out here, for as a like gotcha to JudgeSabo or the anarchist. They have substantive counterclaims to Marxist claims here too. But I want people to understand that if you were just to understand this from this debate about on authority, and if you think that settles the answer, Engels doesn't address most of this, at least not directly. All right. Bakunin also does not shy away from presenting his position as a moral one. Yep, we've already said that. He presents the realizations of freedom as justice, presents it as the foundation of morality, and argues that it implies certain duties and virtues. This aspect of his thought tends to especially contrast with Marx's one, as I've been saying, which not often eschews moral pronouncements. Yeah, our morality is implied, but we argue that human morality is contextual and develops in its very specific historical instances anyway, which is part of the complicatedness here. While Bakunin does not take the same effort to avoid moral claims in his programs and propaganda, this does not necessarily affect his analysis. Oh, I think it does affect his analysis, but it's a central conflict between Marxists and anarchists. Even when we agree, we often arrive at our agreements on fundamentally different grounds. On the contrary, this notion found here about the social nature of freedom is also found in Marx and Engels. I've already said that, and this is correct. For example, in the manifesto of the Communist Party, they proclaim that in place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is a condition for the free development of all. In Capital, Marx argues that socialism will be a society in which the full and free development of each individual forms the ruling principle. The idea of achieving, in some sense, full freedom and the inherent compatibility of the individual and collective freedom as found in their own works as their explicit goal. You will meet leftists today who argue that we don't need to talk about freedom at all. I have seen this from people on the socialist left. Karl Bayer, the blogger, has actually argued this in his defense of the state. A defense that I think is actually fundamentally un-Marxist, and seems to muddle the distinction between liberal and progressive and Marxist ideas. But you also see this in Colin Drum, who thinks that freedom is actually a way to exploit others, and that some kind of central sovereign is necessary to deal with mimetic desire and stuff like that, and thus, a kind of Hobbesian sovereign is necessary for survival, and freedom might be a threat to that. It's essentially only a negative view of freedom. And he has a historical analysis for this related to the conflict between central elite classes and sovereigns versus the large basis of the population, of which the sovereign can seemingly protect. I tend to be less sanguine on that than him, but that's his argument. But in the 19th century, almost no one on the left is rejecting the concept of freedom. Not Bakunin, not Marx, not Proudhon, not Henry George, maybe Blanky. I'm not even sure there. Not the left nationalist, etc., etc., etc. It is a 20th century polemic that associates the idea of equity and the idea of freedom as fundamentally opposed, and it is largely a conservative polemic. Or a right liberal or reactionary polemic. All right. So I would agree with JudgeSabo here that Bakunin and Marx actually agree about the nature of freedom and the full development of all, but they don't agree on how you argue that. All right. This idea of achieving, in some sense, full freedom and the inherent compatibility of the individual and collective freedom is found in their own works as their explicit goal. Yes. Bakunin's emphasis on equality might also be disagreeable to some Marxists. For example, Engels in his later To Babel believed that we needed to move away from the French concept of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In particular, the idea of abolishing social and political equality should be replaced by the abolition of class distinctions. He argued that because complete equity cannot be achieved due to the natural differences in individuals and locations, appeals to equity were too inexact, which I also believe. I have come to the idea that when most people say equality, what they mean is power equality, and in which case that is classlessness. Therefore, I am totally fine with arguing about power equality. But I do think appeals to equality tend to conflate, like, there's too many notions of equality at play, and they do tend to be vague. Similar with freedom, actually, but Marxists tend to avoid that. But as Bakunin has this concept of equality of freedom, see, equality of power is how we would probably call it today. See Daniel of What is Politics, stuff about this. There is more a workable concept here. Bakunin on association even uses the phrase equality of classes as synonymous with abolishing classes. I would say I think the Marxists are actually deliberately more specific because we don't think the classes can exist equally. That their definition is unequal. And therefore, like, the equality of classes in this distributist way is impossible. Where we would just say, like, we would agree with Bakunin on what he's aiming to do in class abolition, and eventually even in statelessness. The difference is what we think happens in a scale of time. And again, this is not an argument that Engels makes in this piece, which is why it's kind of weird that Marxists now use it for so much. This would become a contentious point in his dispute with Marx, who would use this expression to accuse Bakunin of advocating the bourgeois notion of harmony of capital and labor, which is something that I think you can kind of accuse Proudhon of sometimes. I'm not sure you can actually accuse Bakunin of it, but his language is sloppy. And in general, I think Bakunin is not as precise of a writer as Marx. All right. Which Marx will take advantage of sometimes unfairly, and I think misrepresent some of Bakunin's arguments. Right. Having identified Bakunin's notion of freedom and its related concept, we're in a better position to understand his notion of authority in contrast. Point 7. Absolute rejection of every authority, including that which sacrifices freedom for the convenience of the state. Primitive society have no conception of freedom And as society evolved before the full awakening of human rationality and freedom, it passed through a stage controlled by human and divine authority. It's interesting, actually, that Bakunin's notion is that primitive peoples were unfree. This is not something that modern anarchists nor Marxists at the time would have agreed with. David Graeber and John Searson, and don't agree on much, but they're gonna disagree with they're gonna agree with each other against Bakunin on this, and they're actually gonna agree with Marx. All right, but again, this is not an Engels polemic here. You cannot give Engels credit for that because it's not the argument he makes. The political and economic structure of society must now be reorganized on the basis of freedom. Henceforth, order in society must result from the greatest possible realization of individual liberty, as well as the liberty on all levels of social organization. So we see here a teleological argument of unfreedom to freedom, which is actually different from the teleological argument in Marx, which is that freedom was possible in absolute subsistence, but the development of surplus made unfreedom more necessary to maintain social relations and develop the surplus, but that through development of productive forces, we can go back to early human freedom, but not in a lapsarian way, but in a way in which we now have the productive capacity of the unfreedom of which we have moved. That is the dialectical movement Marx is trying to argue for. All right. Scarcity and freedom are linked. Development happens. It creates more and more unfreedom. But the irony is we are now at a point through the productive forces unleashed by capital that we can reverse that and return to our originally free state, but now without the constraints of scarcity. Now, you may argue that this is Promethean, and in the Engels formation, it might be. You may argue that this is foolish, as Cohost does, although I think, having read a lot of Cohost's work now, I like his first book, but as he goes on, I find his arguments more and more strained. And I think he actively misrepresents Engels. Anyway. Point 8, this is from Bakunin again. The political and economic organization of social life must not, as it is at present, be directed from the summit to the base, the center to the circumference, imposing unity through forced centralization. This is a fundamental disagreement with Marx. One that I think people should actually look at the way that centralization has not gone the way Marx and Engels argues, in a way that actually damages the structure of their base of norms from material development. If they're wrong about where the material development goes, they're also wrong about the norms from the structure of their own argument. And this is something, weirdly, I don't even think anarchists have picked up on. Marxists have struggled with it and tried to correct the argument and tried to figure out new implications from it, often, however, damaging themselves by naturalizing their immediate conditions and somehow some longer durée form of capital. But that's beyond the scope of JudgeSabo's argument here. Okay. On the contrary, it must be reorganized the issue from base to summit, from the circumference to the center, according to the principles of free association and federation. And I'm going to add, there's some interesting things about this. Like, there's an obsession with centralized military planning, which even guerrilla warfare disproves. That runs through Marxism, definitely is in Lenin. Lenin's totally obsessed with the central command of the Prussian state, which is actually kind of a disaster. But anyway, Bakunin presents authority here as primarily a negation of freedom. Given his social views of freedom, which require equity and solidarity, authority therefore implies not only unfreedom, but also inequity and privilege. And it does actually in Marx and even Lenin. Lenin talks about how as long as the state exists, you have a class society. All right. Human progress is characterized precisely by this rejection of authority, becoming more advanced as it is based on more freedom. I think that teleology is kind of weird and foolish, and not actually one that you can anthropologically support today, but it is what Bakunin believed, and we need to fairly represent it. Again, since Bakunin recognizes the inherently social nature of freedom, this free society would recognize individual liberty and liberty at all levels of social organization. This weirdly kind of makes Bakunin more of a Whiggish liberal than Marx. I don't know what to do with that. But again, that is not Engels' argument, so we can't give that point to Engels. All right. Bakunin elaborates on this in the next point, contrasting a society marked by hierarchy and forced centralization to one of free association and federation. He frequently uses geometric analysis to illustrate this contrast. I actually think the geometric work of Bakunin is kind of interesting. An authoritarian society concentrates power for the people on top, from the summit to the base, and then concentrates the power to their group against others, from the center to the circumference. Anarchy of free society is marked by the exact opposite, being control from the base to the summit, and the circumstances and the circumference to the center. And weirdly, a lot of Marxists argue this in their third worldism and stuff today, but then they still essentially argue for the need for more and more and more and more and more and more centralization, despite the fact that they've ignored the centralization and automation together actually reduces the centralization of the workforce, thus dividing their workforce in key ways that they did not predict and undermining their whole descriptive argument. This is a big problem for Marxism, and Marxists today kind of just stick their fingers in their ears about it. Interesting enough, it's Marxists that noticed this problem, and this led to several crises, from the revisionist controversy to the distinction between Maoism and Marxist Leninism, Maoism versus classic Marxist Leninism, etc. That's part of what's going on here. All right. Even Martov took a more decentralist argumentation than Lenin did. Interestingly, this analogy does not deny the existence of the center. Julius Martov, the Menshevik who became a Bolshevik when the Mensheviks sided with the whites, but would imply that there is no forced centralization. Bakunin's emphasis on the federation and voluntary community seemed to work well with this. Yes. That centralization may emerge, but it emerges organically from nested communities. All right. This is why both Marxists and anarchists like cybernetic theory. All right. As this criticism goes on, Bakunin describes what he believes to be a free society would look like. It would uphold religious liberty, abolish monarchies, classes in the state, and establish new institutions based on universal suffrage of both sexes. Well, except for religious liberty. Marx would agree with most of that. We would definitely agree on the universal suffrage of both sexes, and probably go further than that. We would definitely want to abolish classes. By abolishing classes, we think we abolish the state, or start to wither it away. We definitely abolish monarchies. Actually, we kind of hope the bourgeois does that. We kind of think religious liberty is a no question, but I think Marxist tendencies to suppress religion has actually been a tactical error that is implied in Marx's writing, but also kind of is in contradiction with Marx's view that a lot of religious stuff will go away on its own when you meet people's material needs. There's a duality to Marx's argument about the need to suppress religion that doesn't really hold. Also, anarchists kill a lot of priests. This is just historically speaking, and their anti-clericalism, like sometimes liberal anti-clericalism, was even more rabid, but sometimes so rabid it turned the peasantry against them. And since the peasantry is often an anarchist base, you can see why this is a problem. His vision is pluralistic, denying that any single blueprint will be appropriate for a free people dealing with a different regional history, geographic, and economic considerations. And I think Marxism goes back and forth on whether or not we actually think Engels actually does think the different regional conditions and social conditions really matters. Engels actually writes really well about this, more than Marx. But not in this piece. He actually kind of makes the opposite argument in this piece. I've had given so much context for this little bit of text, so I'm going to slow down here. I hope I actually have broken down, other than the pieces in On Authority, distinctions between Marxist and Bakuninite anarchist, because I do think those distinctions are important, but I don't know that even when I add those to this argument, that either Bakunin or Marx come out totally right or totally wrong. And there's ways in which I actually do think Marx is the more sophisticated arguer, but sometimes that's a problem. Sophistication does not always mean intellectual honesty. Conversely, I do think there are problems in Bakunin that aren't addressed here, but that since they don't come up in the context of an authority, there's no need to bring them up. But the barracks communist stuff that I brought up in the beginning is relevant because Bakunin was kind of wishy-washy on that shit, and that ends up being a big historical problem. Anyway, if you want more of this and understand the history of the left through text, we do this here in Radical Engagements. I engage with contemporary stuff. I engage with long form retreats. I engage with original arguments here and on Nailing It Down. I also do more behind the Patreon wall. If you want more stuff, although, like I said, I provide the great majority of it for free for the general public. So please share it so people know it exists. All right. But if you want more, there's more behind the Patreon wall, including also the audio only for all these things for as little as $3 a month. And if you just want something by audio or whatever, you can write it and request it, and maybe I can work something out with you. Anyway, take care, like and subscribe, hit the bell, do all the stuff that this rentier capitalist hellscape makes us do, and have a great day.